discussing the Fish and Wildlife Service's newest proposed rule for how they will be implementing the Endangered Species Act. Today I will talk about the history of the ESA, where it started and how it has evolved over the years. I will then discuss this newest proposed rule, how it will impact the process of listing critical habitat, as well as what exactly is changed in the Code of Federal Regulations. I will then discuss where this rule falls short and how it can be improved upon to better include the interests of endangered species moving into the future. So, NEPA's passing in 1970 set out the nation's attitude towards environmental protection at that time. It makes agencies stop to consider their impact on the environment when undertaking new projects, but does not necessarily make them choose the least impactful alternative. In 1973, the passing of the ESA secured Congress's commitment to protecting and threatened and endangered species, as well as their habitat. Under Section 4 of the ESA, the Secretary of the Interior has the power to determine if a habitat should be designated as critical and receive the protection that comes with it. To make this decision, the Secretary draws from scientific studies, analyses, and previous knowledge. Here, the Secretary must decide if the benefits of excluding a habitat outweigh the benefits of including the habitat, unless the exclusion will likely lead to the extinction of the species. The implementation of the ESA has evolved over the years after Supreme Court case decisions, such as those made in Weyerhaeuser Company versus the Fish and Wildlife Service, Lincoln v. Vigil, and Bennett v. Speer. In Weyerhaeuser Company, attention was brought to the Fish and Wildlife Service's ability to designate critical habitat which may be used in the future for the recovery of endangered species, as well as the validity for challenging biological opinions. In Lincoln, the ability for agencies to use their discretionary power was upheld, and here this is important because the Secretary of the Interior and the Fish and Wildlife Service need to use their discretion to determine the scope for the impact of including or excluding a habitat. And the Bennett decision upheld the ability for plaintiffs to challenge the biological opinion under the ESA's citizen suit provision. The facts brought to life in this case demonstrate the importance of considering downstream economic impacts of listing a species or habitat. This new rule carries out Executive Order 13,777, intended to streamline agency actions and reduce regulatory burdens. This rule is intended to increase agency transparency in the exclusion decision-making process, codify current agency practices, and update practices with previous experience, such as that gleaned from court cases. This new rule also adds a section to the end of 50 CFR Part 17, Section 17.90, which sees the publishing of economic analyses in the Federal Register for public notice and comment, as well as mandating the Secretary to consider impacts on national security and, quote, other relevant impacts, which may be impacts on tribes or local health. Here, the Secretary is also given discretion to determine the appropriate scale of these impacts. So while the push for transparency is good, the Fish and Wildlife Service can still do more to improve the protection for endangered species and their habitats. Economic impacts should be considered, but they should not be given as much of a weight as they are now. Potentially, a committee could be set up which could help the Secretary make a better decision when balancing economic impacts and species protection. Now, local knowledge is given somewhat of an important place, but the Secretary may override this local knowledge if he or she has conflicting information. And while the Secretary may have more up-to-date scientific information than local leaders, he or she may be somewhat removed from the immediate impacts of an exclusion decision, and therefore state and local leadership should be given more power when considering endangered species and critical habitat protection into the future. Also this year, there were amendments proposed to Congress for the ESA itself, and these amendments include many of the recommendations that I just discussed, including increased state leadership and full reauthorization for ESA funding. Overall, the Endangered Species Act has been very successful in protecting endangered species as well as their habitats. And this new rule has good intentions, but again, more can be done, such as setting up an interagency committee, which could help the Secretary make more well informed decisions, as well as giving more weight to local knowledge and state leadership.